Have you ever found yourself in a situation where faith seemed insufficient in the face of life's challenges? What if I told you there's a story that can turn that feeling of helplessness into unshakable strength? In this video, we'll explore the inspiring journey of Elijah, a man who, even when facing monumental crises, found courage, renewed his faith, and changed the destiny of an entire nation. And the best part, the lessons from this story can change your life too. As you watch, you'll discover how to overcome moments of despair, find purpose amidst adversity, and apply practical lessons that will help you face your own daily challenges with confidence and determination. Imagine having the wisdom of one of the greatest prophets in history by your side, guiding your decisions and strengthening your faith. This video is the key to unlocking that wisdom. So, if you're seeking answers, strength, or simply a clear path forward, this video is for you. Stay with me and see how Elijah's story can be the inspiration you need to transform your life. From his earliest steps, Elijah knew his destiny was different. Raised in Tishbe, in the town of Gilead, he felt the presence of something greater in his life. It wasn't just a vague feeling. It was a calling. This intimate connection with God shaped his journey from a young age, something few deeply understand. Imagine someone growing up with the conviction that they are destined for something grand, as if every movement was guided by an invisible hand. Elijah carried this certainty, something that today few can recognize in themselves. The context in which Elijah lived was far from simple. King Ahab's reign in Israel brought times of uncertainty and idolatry, where faithfulness to the true God was at risk. Even as a young man, Elijah perceived the darkness approaching, a spiritual storm threatening to sweep away all that was sacred. He wasn't just aware of it. He felt the weight of this responsibility, like a beacon in the fog. For those who live in a world of constant distractions, it's hard to grasp the clarity of purpose that Elijah had, something that guided every one of his actions. Elijah wasn't an ordinary man. He was an instrument of God in times of disorder. His life from the start was intertwined with divine sovereignty. If we delve into his childhood, we can imagine the questions he asked, the silent conversations he had in moments of solitude. It's as if, from the beginning, Elijah knew his mission wouldn't be easy, but that each challenge would be preparation for something greater. And so, each step he took brought him closer to an inescapable destiny. The simplicity of Tishbe contrasted with the complexity of the mission Elijah would face. Tishbe was a small town, almost insignificant by Israel's standards, but it was the place chosen by God to shape the character of a prophet who would change history. How many times do we wonder why we were born in a certain place or situation? Elijah shows us that even in the humblest settings, the origins of great change can be found. This is a powerful reminder for anyone questioning the impact of their own lives. The divine calling didn't come in a moment of grandeur, but in the simplicity of the everyday. Elijah didn't receive a spectacular vision by human standards. It was through the constancy of his faith and observation of the reality around him that he began to understand his purpose. This teaches us that the calling doesn't always come amidst the extraordinary, but in persistence and recognition of the small things. Elijah, in his youth, already understood the power of these small revelations. Elijah grew up in an environment where God's presence was palpable, and this shaped his view of the world. He didn't see difficulties as obstacles, but as opportunities to prove his faith and determination. Imagine the confidence he developed over the years, knowing that each challenge was a chance to draw even closer to God. In modern times, this perspective can be an antidote to the despair many feel in the face of daily problems. With this firmness of purpose, Elijah was ready to face what lay ahead. He knew his life wouldn't be an easy journey, but he was prepared. The sense of being guided by something greater gave him the courage to face the uncertain future. And so, with a heart full of conviction, Elijah prepared for what would be one of the most challenging missions of his life. Confronting King Ahab and his queen Jezebel, challenging everything that was established in Israel, Elijah knew that confronting Ahab would be inevitable. The king, influenced by Jezebel, had turned the hearts of the people of Israel towards the worship of Baal, a pagan god. The prophet couldn't ignore the weight of this spiritual betrayal. Imagine the growing tension as Elijah, a simple man but full of faith, prepared to face the most powerful ruler in Israel. He knew he wasn't just facing a king, but a corrupt system that threatened to destroy the essence of his people's faith. When Elijah finally confronted Ahab, his words were like a sharp sword, cutting through the spiritual darkness that had settled over Israel. He wasn't afraid to proclaim the truth, even knowing it would put his life at risk. "There shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word," he said, decreeing a devastating drought that would shake the kingdom. This act of courage reminds us that in times of crisis, the truth must be spoken, regardless of the consequences. Elijah showed that true faith doesn't hide, but faces challenges head-on. Ahab, being a powerful king, was used to controlling everything around him. But Elijah was uncontrollable, because his loyalty wasn't to an earthly throne but to the God of Israel. This confrontation is a classic example of how spiritual authority can challenge secular authority. Elijah knew that Ahab and Jezebel were mere pawns before divine sovereignty, and this gave him unshakable confidence. Today, when we face authorities or systems that seem insurmountable, Elijah's story reminds us that true strength comes from unwavering faith and a greater purpose. By decreeing the drought, Elijah wasn't just bringing about a natural calamity. He was sending a powerful message. The drought represented the spiritual emptiness in Israel, a land that had turned away from the true God. Elijah's choice to use nature itself as an instrument of God shows the depth of his connection with the divine. Imagine the people's reaction as they saw the sky closed, not a cloud in sight, and the crops wilting under the relentless sun. Elijah wanted them to physically feel what they were suffering spiritually. The confrontation with Ahab was more than just a simple clash between a prophet and a king. It was a battle for the soul of Israel. Elijah knew that Ahab's actions, encouraged by Jezebel, were leading the people into the abyss of idolatry. Elijah's courage in standing against this tide teaches us about the importance of defending our values, even when everything around us seems contrary. In our own lives, how many times do we find ourselves in situations where we need to take a firm stand, even if it puts us in danger? However, Elijah didn't just confront Ahab with harsh words. He also demonstrated the strength of the true God through his actions. The drought was proof that God was in control, and that all of Ahab and Jezebel's attempts to consolidate the worship of Baal would be in vain. Elijah teaches us that when we are aligned with God's will, we don't need to fear the forces that rise against us. He showed that even in the most difficult circumstances, faith can move mountains and change the course of an entire nation. With the decree of the drought, Elijah took the first step on a journey that would transform Israel. But he knew that confronting Ahab was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come, and Elijah would have to face even greater challenges, both physical and spiritual. However, he was prepared because he knew he wasn't alone. God's hand guided him, and that was all he needed to move forward, even when the road ahead seemed impossible to travel. After proclaiming the drought, Elijah found himself in a delicate position, that of a prophet on the run. Following divine guidance, he hid by the brook of Cherith. Imagine the solitude that surrounded him, but also the peace that emanated from that isolated place. There, in the midst of the quiet, he was sustained in a miraculous way. Ravens, usually associated with death and despair, became messengers of sustenance, bringing bread and meat to Elijah. This detail is fascinating because it shows how God can transform even the most unexpected elements into instruments of provision. Elijah lived on the fringes of society, but never on the fringes of divine presence. In the silence of the desert, he found an intimate communion with God, something that few people today can experience in their busy lives. The lesson here is clear. Sometimes it's in isolation that we find the greatest revelations. When everything around us falls silent, God's voice becomes more audible. In moments of solitude where many see desolation, Elijah found the source of his sustenance and spiritual strength. But like everything in life, The time by the brook of Cherith came to an end. The brook dried up and Elijah had to move on. Often we face phases in our lives where resources seem to dwindle and we are forced to change direction. The drying up of the brook wasn't a sign of abandonment but an invitation to the next step in the journey. Elijah didn't lament the loss of the brook. He followed divine guidance to Zarephath. This movement teaches us to trust in God's plan, even when circumstances force us to leave what once seemed like a place of comfort and provision. Arriving in Zarephath, Elijah found a widow in the midst of adversity. Her situation was desperate. She was on the brink of death, with only a handful of flour and a little oil left. But Elijah, with unshakable faith, asked her to use the little she had to make bread for him. It may seem insensitive at first glance, but in reality, it was a test of faith for both Elijah and the widow. And she, in her obedience, witnessed a miracle. The flour and oil never ran out. This event shows us that when we trust in God and act in faith, even the little we have can multiply in unexpected ways. The miracle in Zarephath was not only a demonstration of God's power but also proof that obedience and faith are rewarded. The widow, in giving up the little she had, received in return the security of continuous sustenance. Elijah, in turn, saw his own faith strengthened by witnessing the multiplication. In our lives, we often cling to the little we have, fearing to lose everything. But Elijah and the widow's story teaches us that when we give what we have in trust to God, He can transform it into something much greater. The multiplication of flour and oil in Zarephath was a miracle that ensured the survival of Elijah and the widow during the drought. However, this event also symbolizes something deeper, divine provision that never fails. Even in times of scarcity, those who trust in God are sustained in ways that defy human logic. Elijah learned this in his solitude, and the widow of Zarephath had the opportunity to experience this principle in her own life. And so, in the midst of adversity, both were strengthened to continue their journey of faith. But Elijah's journey in Zarephath was far from over. He knew that there would still be challenges ahead, and that God would continue to shape and guide him through circumstances that would test his faith and resilience. The next challenge he would face would be even more intense, something that would push him to the limit of his strength and faith. And once again, Elijah was ready to move forward, fully trusting in the divine guidance that led him every step of the way. Elijah's life in Zarephath seemed peaceful after the miracle of multiplication, but the calm was interrupted by tragedy. The widow's son, her only child, fell seriously ill and died. Imagine the weight of this loss for a woman who had so little. For Elijah, who had witnessed divine provision, this was a deep blow, shaking his own faith. However, he didn't resign himself to despair. Instead, he brought the situation before God, crying out for divine intervention. Elijah, with a heavy heart, went up to the room where the boy's body lay. There, in an act of faith and desperation, he stretched himself out on the boy's body and cried out to the Lord 3 times. This gesture is laden with symbolism and demonstrates the depth of his trust in God. In a world where answers seem increasingly quick and instant, Elijah's persistence reminds us that some prayers require time, surrender, and repetition. He didn't give up on the first request nor the second, but continued until he saw life return to the boy. The miracle of resurrection was more than just a return to physical life. It was a rebirth of faith for both Elijah and the widow. Imagine the impact of this event in Zarephath, a small town that now became the stage for one of the greatest miracles of the Old Testament. The boy's resurrection not only restored a mother's hope, but also reaffirmed Elijah's mission as a prophet of God. In the darkest moments where everything seems lost, Elijah teaches us that God can still work miracles, bringing life where there was once death. For the widow, the return of her son was irrefutable proof of God's power and the authenticity of Elijah as a prophet. Her pain was transformed into joy, and her doubt into faith. Elijah, in turn, felt the weight of his mission reinforced. He wasn't just a prophet who proclaimed harsh words and distant miracles. He was a channel of life, someone through whom God acted directly in the most personal and intimate situations. This experience brought a new dimension to his mission, showing that divine intervention wasn't just for the masses but also for individuals. Elijah, after the miracle, was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The intensity of what had happened left him in a state of desolation, something that everyone can experience after great personal battles. However, this exhaustion wasn't a sign of weakness, but a reminder of Elijah's humanity. Even the greatest prophets and leaders have their moments of fatigue, and this is something many can relate to. But unlike many, Elijah found renewal in his faith, even in the midst of his desolation. The miracle of resurrection also served as a prelude to the even greater challenges that Elijah would face. He knew that the fight against idolatry and corruption in Israel was far from over, and once again, he was being prepared by God, this time through pain and redemption, to face these challenges. The resurrection of the widow's son was a powerful reminder that even when everything seems lost, God can intervene in surprising and transformative ways. With a renewed heart, Elijah rose, ready to continue his journey. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but the miracle in Zarephath reinforced his confidence in God's power and faithfulness. The next challenge he would face would be on Mount Carmel, an epic confrontation that would decide Israel's spiritual future. But before reaching there, Elijah first had to confront his own fears and doubts. Strengthened by the certainty that God was with him every step of the way, Mount Carmel was the scene of one of the most dramatic events in Elijah's life. With unshakable courage, he challenged the 450 prophets of Baal to prove who was the true God of Israel. Imagine the tension in the air as Elijah, alone, faced a crowd of adversaries, all determined to prove that Baal was the supreme God. But Elijah knew he was on a divine mission, and that the outcome of this challenge would not only define Israel's spiritual future, but also demonstrate God's sovereignty to the entire nation. Elijah proposed a clear and direct test. Both he and the prophets of Baal would prepare a sacrifice, but without lighting the fire. The God who responded with fire would be the true God. The prophets of Baal began their invocations, crying out and cutting themselves in desperation, but nothing happened. Imagine the scene: the sky silent, without a response, while Elijah calmly watched. This silence wasn't just the absence of fire, but the exposure of Baal's impotence, a moment that unmasked the falsehood of the pagan worship that had seduced Israel. When it was Elijah's turn, he did something unexpected. He instructed that the altar and the sacrifice be drenched with water, an action that seemed to contradict the logic of the moment. To many, this could be seen as an act of madness, but to Elijah, it was a demonstration of absolute faith. He wanted everyone to know without a shadow of a doubt that the fire that would come wasn't the result of human tricks, but an unmistakable sign of God's power. It's as if Elijah was saying, "Even in the most impossible circumstances, my God can do the impossible." Then Elijah prayed. It wasn't a long or complicated prayer, but simple and powerful. "O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel." And in an instant, fire fell from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water that drenched the altar. This moment was the supreme manifestation of God's sovereignty. Imagine the impact on those who witnessed it. What began as a challenge turned into an overwhelming revelation of divine power. Elijah not only won the challenge, he reversed the tide of unbelief that dominated Israel. God's response was so impressive that the people fell to their knees, proclaiming, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." This event marked a turning point in Israel's history, a return to faith in the true God. Elijah showed that with faith, it's possible to face even the greatest challenges and emerge victorious. This moment on Mount Carmel wasn't just a personal victory for Elijah, but a restoration of the faith of an entire nation. In our own lives, we often find ourselves in personal Mount Carmels, where our faith is tested, and Elijah teaches us that with God, we can triumph over any adversity. But as with many great deeds, the challenge on Mount Carmel wasn't the end of the battle for Elijah. Even after such a spectacular triumph, he knew that the forces opposing faith in Israel wouldn't surrender so easily. Jezebel, furious with the defeat of the prophets of Baal, still posed a real threat, and Elijah would have to face the consequences of his act of faith. But for now he could savor the victory, knowing he had been a powerful instrument in God's hands, bringing the people back to the truth. With the fire of Mount Carmel still burning in his memory, Elijah prepared for the next step. The challenge had been won, but the mission was far from complete. The restoration of Israel required more than a single act of power. It demanded perseverance, courage, and a faith that didn't waver in the face of threats. And so, with a heart strengthened by victory, Elijah turned to the next challenge, bringing the rain back to a thirsty land, an additional proof that the God of Israel was indeed in control. After the triumph on Mount Carmel, Elijah faced another great challenge, bringing the rain back to Israel. The country had suffered a long and severe drought, a direct consequence of the idolatry promoted by Ahab and Jezebel. Elijah knew that the thirsty land needed not only water but also a spiritual rebirth. Imagine the scene: the cracked soil, the withered crops, the despair on the people's faces. Elijah, with his unshakable faith, went to the top of Mount Carmel, knowing that the next miracle was about to happen. At the top of the mountain, Elijah bowed down to the ground with his face between his knees, in deep prayer. He sent his servant to look towards the sea, searching for a sign of rain. 7 times the servant returned with the same answer: "There is nothing." But Elijah did not lose heart. He knew the answer would come at the right time and that perseverance in prayer was essential. This moment teaches us the importance of persistence, especially when the results seem distant. How many times in our lives do we give up on the 6th try, when the 7th could bring the answer we so desperately seek? Finally, on the 7th time, the servant returned with a new message. "Behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea." To many, this small sign might seem insignificant, but to Elijah it was the confirmation that the rain was on its way. He instructed his servant to tell Ahab to prepare his chariot and go down before the rain stopped him. This small cloud symbolizes the first answers to our prayers, which, although they may seem small, carry within them the potential for great changes. Elijah shows us that we must be attentive to the signs, no matter how small, and act with faith and readiness. In a matter of minutes, the sky was filled with black clouds, the wind began to blow, and torrential rain fell on the land of Israel. The drought that had plagued the nation was finally broken. This event was more than just the return of water. It was a symbol of God's blessing returning to a people who had strayed. Elijah, by bringing the rain, was directly participating in the spiritual restoration of Israel. Today, this story reminds us that faith can not only transform individual circumstances, but also bring renewal to an entire community. The moment of rain was a complete victory, but Elijah did not stop to celebrate it. In an act that can only be described as supernatural, he tucked his cloak into his belt and ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel, a considerable distance. This shows us that even after great victories, there is still work to be done. Elijah's run represents the urgency and energy we often need to maintain, even after achieving a goal. He didn't allow himself to rest because he knew the spiritual battle was far from over. With the rain falling on Israel and the people witnessing God's power, Elijah knew that the next challenge was looming. Jezebel, furious with the defeat on Mount Carmel and the humiliation of Baal, would not give up easily. The coming of the rain was a great triumph, but it also marked the beginning of a new period of trials for Elijah. He was aware that his mission was still ongoing and that the difficulties he would face next would require even more faith and courage. And so, with the rain finally falling on Israel, Elijah prepared for what was to come. The restoration of the land had begun, but the complete restoration of faith in Israel was yet to come. He knew that his journey was far from over, and that the next steps in his mission would be crucial to ensuring the people did not return to idolatry. The next challenge would be personal, an internal struggle against despair and fear as he faced the imminent threat of Jezebel. After the triumph on Mount Carmel and the coming of the rain, Elijah found himself in a new kind of battle, an internal battle. Jezebel, furious with the humiliation of Baal and the death of her prophets, swore to kill Elijah. This oath echoed in his mind, and the prophet, who had previously faced hundreds of enemies with courage, now felt the weight of fear and exhaustion. He fled to the desert, a place that symbolizes both desolation and the search for renewal. Elijah's flight reminds us that even the strongest have their moments of weakness, and that sometimes the weight of the mission can lead us to question our own strength. In the desert, Elijah sat under a broom tree and, in a moment of despair, asked God to take his life. "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." These words reveal a deep weariness, not just physical but spiritual. Elijah, who had witnessed God's power so grandly, now felt completely defeated. This feeling is something many can relate to, the sense of having reached the limit, of not having the strength to continue. But just as with Elijah, these moments can be turning points in our lives. However, even in his despair, God did not abandon Elijah. While he slept, an angel touched him and said, "Arise and eat." When Elijah awoke, he found a cake baked on hot stones in a jar of water. He ate and lay down again, and the angel touched him a second time, saying, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." This divine care shows us that even in our darkest moments, God cares for us in practical and tangible ways. Elijah needed strength to continue, and God provided exactly what he needed. Revitalized, Elijah walked 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. This time in the desert was both a physical and spiritual journey, where Elijah had the opportunity to reflect on his mission and reconnect with God. Elijah's journey to Horeb symbolizes the journey we all must make in times of crisis, a return to the source of our faith, where we can find clarity and direction. The desert, often seen as a place of desolation, can also be a place of renewal and new vision. On Mount Horeb, Elijah experienced something extraordinary. God instructed him to stand on the mount before the Lord. First, a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks. But God was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. But God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But God was not in the fire. Finally came a gentle whisper, and it was in that whisper that Elijah heard God's voice. This experience was a powerful lesson on how God speaks to us, not always through great signs and wonders, but often in silence and quietness. Elijah learned that even amidst chaos, it is in stillness that God's true voice can be heard. This revelation on Mount Horeb brought Elijah a new perspective. He understood that his mission was not yet complete, and that God had more work for him to do. Despite the despair that had driven him to the desert, Elijah was reminded that his life had a greater purpose, and that God was still guiding his steps. God's gentle whisper not only gave Elijah the direction he needed, but also restored his confidence in his mission. With this new clarity, Elijah was ready to move forward. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he also knew that God was with him every step of the way. The gentle voice he heard on Mount Horeb was a reminder that even when the world around us is in turmoil, God is still in control. And so, Elijah descended the mountain, revitalized and with renewed determination to fulfill the calling God had placed on his life. After the transformative experience on Mount Horeb, Elijah received a clear mission from God, which came not through grand manifestations, but in a gentle whisper. This whisper, as discreet as it was powerful, revealed to Elijah that God still had specific plans for him. Elijah, who had been consumed by despair, now saw his mission with new clarity. He learned that God doesn't always manifest in spectacular ways. Sometimes it's in the simplest and most unexpected things that he speaks to us. This teaches us that in our search for direction and purpose, we must be attentive to the whispers in life, those subtle moments that may contain the answers we seek. God instructed Elijah to move forward and anoint Hazael as king over Syria, Jehu as king over Israel, and Elisha as his successor. Each of these anointings carried deep significance, not only for Elijah, but for the nation of Israel. Elijah understood that his mission was greater than himself, that he was being called to prepare the way for future generations. The anointing of Elisha in particular marked the beginning of a new prophetic era. This shows us that in our lives we are often called to pass the baton, to prepare those who will come after us, ensuring that the mission continues. The choice of Elisha as a successor was a crucial moment in Elijah's life. When he found Elisha plowing the fields, he threw his mantle over him, a symbolic gesture of the transfer of authority and responsibility. Elisha, understanding the magnitude of this act, left everything to follow Elijah. This encounter teaches us about the importance of recognizing and responding to the divine calling. even if it means leaving behind our own ambitions and securities. Elijah and Elisha formed a partnership that would not only ensure the continuity of prophecy in Israel, but also model what it means to be a mentor and disciple. Elijah knew that his mission was approaching its end, but this did not diminish his determination. He continued to carry out God's instructions, anointing Hazael and Jehu, ensuring that the new leaders were aligned with the divine will. These acts of anointing were more than mere rituals. They were the realization of God's plan to purify Israel and restore true worship. Elijah shows us that, until the last moment of our mission, we must remain faithful to the calling we have received, knowing that each act of obedience has a lasting impact. Elijah's legacy would not be one of words and actions alone, but of transformed lives. Elisha, who accompanied Elijah to the end, absorbed the spirit and authority of his mentor. This mentor-disciple relationship teaches us about the importance of investing in others, of sharing the knowledge and experience we have accumulated throughout life. Elijah knew that his time was coming to an end, but he also knew that by leaving Elisha prepared, his mission would continue. This is a powerful lesson about leadership and legacy. The true measure of our impact is not just what we do, but what we inspire others to do. Even knowing that his time on earth was ending, Elijah did not give in to complacency. He continued to follow God's voice, carrying out each task with diligence and faith. This final obedience of Elijah was a testament to his faithfulness until the last moment. For those who look to Elijah's life, there is a clear lesson. We must follow the calling to the end, knowing that each step we take in obedience to God leaves a legacy that transcends our own life. And so, with his mission almost complete, Elijah prepared for his final act of obedience. He knew that the time of his ascension was near, but before departing, he ensured that faith in Israel was secure in the hands of Elisha and the new leaders he had anointed. Elijah was ready to leave this world, knowing that he had fulfilled the divine calling and that the mission he had initiated would continue to shape Israel's future. The next step would be his glorious ascension to heaven, an event that would forever mark the history of Israel and faith. The end of Elijah's journey was marked by a unique and extraordinary event, his ascension to heaven in a whirlwind. Elijah knew that his time on earth was coming to an end, but it would not be an ordinary departure. He and Elisha walked together, aware that this was the last day they would spend side by side. This walk was full of meaning, a moment of farewell, but also of preparation. Elijah was about to be taken in a way that no other prophet had experienced, and Elisha, who accompanied him, would be the witness to this passage. Imagine the mix of emotions they both felt, knowing they were on the brink of one of the greatest miracles in biblical history. As they walked, Elijah tested Elisha's determination, asking him to stay behind at various points along the way. But Elisha, with a firmness that reflected the importance of his calling, refused to leave him. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you," he responded to each request. This insistence of Elisha teaches us about the importance of being present at crucial moments, of not abandoning those who have guided us, even when the path becomes difficult. Elijah, seeing his disciples' persistence, knew he had chosen his successor well. Finally, they arrived at the Jordan River. Elijah, with his mantle, struck the waters, and they parted, allowing the two to cross on dry ground. This final act of power was a reminder of the divine calling that had guided Elijah from the beginning. The Jordan, a river that symbolizes transition and new beginnings, was the stage for Elijah's last miracle on earth. He knew he was about to cross into a new existence, and the miracle in the waters was a kind of final blessing for Elisha, a confirmation that God's power would continue with him. This moment makes us reflect on the transitions in our own lives and how, with faith, we can overcome any obstacle. After crossing the Jordan, Elijah asked Elisha what he would like to receive before his departure. Elisha, without hesitation, asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. This request was not out of ambition, but out of a deep desire to continue his mentor's work with the same intensity and dedication. Elijah, recognizing Elisha's sincerity, responded that if he saw Elijah being taken, then his request would be granted. This dialogue between the two prophets shows us the importance of seeking more than just knowledge. We must seek the spirit and passion that enable us to accomplish great things. And then, as they were walking and talking, a chariot of fire with horses of fire appeared, separating the two. Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, leaving his mantle behind. Elisha, seeing this, cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." With tears in his eyes, he tore his clothes in mourning, but he picked up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen. This moment was both one of loss and legacy. Elijah had departed, but his mission, his spirit, and his authority now rested on Elisha. Elijah's ascension is a powerful reminder that death is not the end, but a transition to something greater, and that the legacy we leave behind can continue to influence lives long after we are gone. Elisha, now with Elijah's mantle, returned to the Jordan, and with the same faith his mentor had demonstrated, struck the waters, and they parted again. This miracle confirmed that the double portion of Elijah's spirit now rested on Elisha. The mission that Elijah had begun was secure in the hands of his successor, and God's work would continue to advance in Israel. Elijah's ascension marked not only the end of his earthly journey, but the beginning of a new prophetic era in Israel, an era that would continue to influence the nation for generations. And so, with Elijah's ascension to heaven, the story of one of Israel's greatest prophets came to an end. But his legacy, carried on by Elisha and the generations that followed, continued to impact the nation and inspire the faith of many. Elijah not only fulfilled his mission, he left a lasting example of obedience, courage, and unwavering faith. His ascension reminds us that when our journey on earth comes to an end, what truly matters is the lasting impact we leave on the lives we touch. Have you ever stopped to think about how the lessons we've just explored can directly impact your life? Just as Elijah faced gigantic challenges with faith and determination, you too can apply these principles to overcome any obstacle you're facing. But now what? What will you do with this knowledge? My suggestion is simple. Put into practice what you learned today. Try living with the same courage and faith that Elijah demonstrated, even when everything seems lost. Now I want to know, what will you do differently starting today? What changes can you begin to implement right now? Leave your answers in the comments. This is the perfect opportunity to share your thoughts and learn from the community. And if this video inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any of the upcoming content that, like this one, can help transform your life. And speaking of transformation, if you want to continue your journey of faith and knowledge, I have an unmissable recommendation. Discover the hidden truths of the Sermon on the Mount. In one of his most powerful sermons, Jesus revealed secrets that can revolutionize the way you see life and spirituality. Don't miss this chance to uncover the Bible like never before. Click on the next video and let these truths impact your heart.